Winter is coming on the Somme, a time of quietness, of solitude on those massive landscapes of Picardy. And in this episode, we take a winter walk on the Somme battlefields of 1916. It's that time of year when the weather along the old front line begins to change. Autumn is moving closer to winter, and the nights grow longer and the days shorter, and the temperature drops. There's been the first frost on the Somme, and this week that I'm recording this episode, there'll be the first falls of snow. The seasons change, and with it, the battlefields, the landscape of the Great War, that changes too. It's all part of our experience, I think, when we visit these battlefields of the Great War, seeing them in the different seasons, experiencing that changing weather is all part of what we get when we walk those pathways and head for those beacons on that landscape of the past. And what the weather does, I guess, is give us a bit of a nod to the past. We can feel that weather in our modern clothing that gives us protection, and we can think of those troops in those shallow ditches, in those vast open fields, with very little to protect them from the snow, from the sub-zero temperatures, aside from all that was happening around them on the battlefield. But there's also a quietness in the winter. The battlefields are not as busy with casual visitors, and you can have that landscape to yourself. So in this episode, we're going to take a winter walk on the Somme, starting in a well-trodden place by this podcast at Courcelette, but taking some tracks that we haven't followed as yet on the old front line, and making our journey towards Thiepval, the village on that high ridge beyond, and ending in the area close to the Ancre Valley. So this will be ground that will chronologically cover probably most of the battle one way and another, from the bright sunshine of the 1st of July 1916 through to the cold and the snow and the darkness and the end of the battle in November of the same year. And it highlights the importance of walking the ground. By walking it, we connect to it in a way that we can't do just by travelling around in our car or on a coach. Both of those are very valid and important ways of understanding the battlefields, the landscape of the First World War. But at times you need to get out onto it and connect to it in this way, where it's you in that landscape, with the bird song above you, the vastness of it around you, and the echoes of the past somehow all around you. So with winter approaching, let's pick a crisp, imaginary winter's day, strap on our virtual boots and pick up our pack and head down those lanes of Picardy, now frozen, not dusty, as they were in the summer. And let's begin just outside the village of Courcelette. Many of the walks that we've done in this podcast follow a particular action or part of a great battle or offensive, or perhaps a series of cemeteries on that landscape of the First World War, and we will visit some as part of this walk. But this is more typical of a walk that I once would have done when I lived at Courcelette, walking out in the winter across the landscape of the Somme, and a walk that I've done on and off many, many times over the years. Sometimes you just need to get out onto those battlefields and walk and see where those pathways take you. But as I know many of you like to listen as you look at a map, as you look at Google Maps, sometimes follow that with Street View. I've put a map of this route, of this walk, onto the podcast website, so you can check it out there. So where are we? Well, we've walked from the outskirts, the western outskirts of the village of Courcelette, and on that bend in the road that takes you to the next village of Pozieres is a green Commonwealth War Graves Commission sign pointing across those fields towards Courcelette British Cemetery, and the sign names it there too. And as you walk down that minor track with the open fields on your right and a bank on your left, this is often a place where the local farmers bring the iron harvest. Many villages have a location where the farmers, those who work on the land here, bring those dangerous munitions that are found every year without fail in every time that they plough this ground, to a point where the local bomb disposal unit or equivalent of can come to collect them. And along this track, along that bank, there have been wooden potato boxes normally used to store potatoes prior to them going off to be sold. But in this case, no pomme de terre, instead munitions and shells and grenades and just about everything you can think of connected to that arsenal of weaponry that was used in the Great War. But it's not that we've come to see. You can't walk this ground, particularly in the kind of off-the-beaten-track locations that we are going to take as part of this walk, and fail to see the iron harvest, the detritus of war, one of those many legacies of the First World War that's still there after a century, particularly at this time of year in the winter, following the deep ploughing and the fields left for their winter slumber. By the sides of them, there are often shells and grenades, trench mortars, and anything really that you can imagine that was used by both sides to try and kill each other during those 4 years of the Great War. But as we come to the end of this track, it forks. The track, which is essentially straight ahead, would take you to the village of Pozieres, and that track, during the fighting for the village of Courcelette that we've just come from, when the Canadians captured that on the 15th September 1916 with the assistance of tanks, when tanks were used for the first time. This route, after the capture of the village, became a main arterial route for supplies, for men, equipment, food, small arms ammunition, just about everything that the soldiers, the Canadian soldiers from the Canadian Corps, fighting their first great battle as a Canadian Corps under the command of Sir Julian Byng, who would go on to command them a year later at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is what he's most famous for and what Canada is most famous for in many ways during the Great War, and is a subject that we have discussed many times on this podcast. And there is a link to Vimy because the Canadian soldiers who were killed on this battlefield, 8,500 Canadians were killed in action between September and November of 1916. Over 6,000 of them have no known grave, and that amounts to nearly half of the names that are carved into the stone of the Vimy Memorial. But we're going to turn off to the right. We're not going to take that track that once went and still does go to Pozieres. We're going to head up to the obvious military cemetery that we can see ahead of us. If you've followed me on social media over a long period of time, you'll know that this is a view that you're seeing now as the road rises ahead of you and bends slightly a few times as you walk nearer, closer to the cemetery ahead. This is a view that I've photographed, and my pictures of it I've posted online many, many times. If there's one part of that old front line that is particularly significant, that I feel particularly close to, it's this walk, this place here. Not just because I lived here for a long time, but because I think of a wider significance of what I see as I walk up this track towards the cemetery, how for me it really symbolises what the old front line, what this landscape, the battlefields of the Great War really mean. And it's a vast open bit of ground here with not much of the modern world visible. And for a big chunk of the year, the sun sets behind the cemetery at different angles, and it is a great place to take sunsets, and I've taken many, many here over the years. And although I no longer live at Courcelette, I return here on a regular basis to stand at this spot and walk up to the cemetery as we're doing now, because I think it is so significant. It's an unusual setting on the Somme, with a slightly elevated cemetery on a rise, but it's a cemetery as we come up to the entrance and we walk along the neatly manicured bank on our left. We can see the large stone portal entrance and the steps coming up into the main body of the cemetery, and we can see two distinct plots of graves facing each other, one on the left and one on the right. And on the left, most of those graves are Australian. A very high proportion are men from the Australian Imperial Force who fell close to Pozieres, which we can see across the fields just beyond the trees of the cemetery, or at Maky Farm, Ferme de Maky, which we're going to pass and talk about later on in this walk. And then when we look to our right, instead of seeing the rising sun cap badge of the Australians, we see the maple leaf. And this plot on the right, the initial one started by British troops, but that main plot generally are Canadian soldiers who fell at Courcelette in September, and some in October, but mostly men who fell in September of 1916, from the capture of the village by the Canadians through to the fighting of some of the other trenches, Zollengraben and the advance towards Regina Trench. There's many soldiers that I've researched who are buried here, and over the many, many visits that I've made here, and I've seen a particular name, sometimes I feel that the headstones, the men they represent, almost call to you from the past and challenge you to find out more about who they are. And I've certainly had that quite a few times, not just in this cemetery, but many, many cemeteries on that landscape of the First World War. But in here, I've researched quite a few of them, including some men whose medals or memorial plaques that I have, particularly in this plot on the right-hand side. And in 1998, there was an additional burial here. Russell Basisto, an Australian soldier who was identified by his aluminium identity disc found close to the Pozieres windmill, who was laid to rest here by men of the 27th Battalion Australian Imperial Force, now a unit, still certainly was then, a unit of the Australian Army. They carried his coffin up that route that we've just walked, and he was buried here in a special ceremony. One of many soldiers that have been found on this battlefield around Courcelette that have been reburied in one of the three cemeteries that are here, Corselet being one, Regina Trench Cemetery another, and Adanac Cemetery over on the far side of the village towards Miramont being the third, Adanac being Canada spelt backwards, being a kind of nod to the sacrifice of Canadian soldiers here during the Great War. And I kind of always feel when I come here that I'm amongst friends. I think those of you that have walked the battlefields of the First World War will probably kind of know what I mean. I know a lot about some of these men. Others, I know nothing, and I'm still finding out information about them. But somehow there's a calming feeling as we walk amongst these stones and we think about these men and we connect to them, connect to their stories, connect to who they were, not just as soldiers, but as human beings with families, with wives and children, or mothers and fathers. And we can understand the wider significance of their sacrifice and what their loss here in 1916 meant for people who in many cases were many thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. I've always felt it a great privilege to be able to walk battlefields connected to Canada, and the same from Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and all of the other nations of the Commonwealth, because this was quite literally once on my doorstep, and many from those nations would love to have an opportunity to do what I have done. So I always try and have a nod to these men, thinking that perhaps so many others, people of their nations, would love that opportunity to do that themselves. And I hope many of you, and I know many of you, have been inspired by listening to this podcast to come from the other side of the world, from Australia or New Zealand, or from across the Atlantic in America or Canada, to come and visit some of these places. And it's great to hear about that. And it's so important that all of us, this is all part of all of our collective story, and so important for us to come here and connect to it. But what we find when we walk a cemetery like this, as I've said many times, these are time capsules of the First World War, and they're not just a sepulchre to remember the dead forevermore. They tell us a lot about the nature of the fighting when we look at the number of unknowns that are buried in cemeteries like this, and how artillery can smash landscapes, but also smash graves and the fragile human remains that are lying on those landscapes of 1916. We can see how some units were affected more than others. We can see predominance of dates, 15th of September 1916 in this case, and also the 26th of September when the Canadians attacked again around the village to try and push the Germans back and get some initial footings towards Regina Trench. And with the Australians, we see a lot of different dates throughout that summer of July and August of 1916, reflecting the terrible attritional nature of the fighting around the village of Pozieres, the attacks on the OG lines where Besisto fell, the old German lines around the high point of the windmill, or in the approaches to Ferme de Mouquet, Maky Farm, or the Elbow close to the village. All of these deadly battlefields for Australian soldiers in that summer of 1916, when Australia lost 23,000 men on the Somme, almost as many as they had lost at Gallipoli the year before. And here, looking back into the village of Courcelette, on the fringes of the modern world, we begin to kind of move away from that world, go back in time almost as much as we ever can. But I think the further you walk into these obscure corners of the Somme, in the places when you are away from that modern world, perhaps the more that you can somehow connect to the events of 1916. So having walked along the rows of graves, having opened the cemetery visitor's book, the little locker with the visitor's book and the cemetery register inside, and seen how few people ever sign that register here. It doesn't get that many visitors, Courcelette British Cemetery, perhaps on the increase a bit, which is good. And it's always interesting to read the registers and the visitors' books, because the visitors' books, you see all kinds of comments giving you an insight into why someone has come all that way to visit a particular cemetery, for a grave, for a reason, for a relative who survived. This cemetery, acting as that beacon to the Battle of the Somme, brings people to a place where they can see the ground today and imagine a grandfather who survived this and what he might have done here more than a century ago. But we'll leave the ghosts of Courcelette British Cemetery behind for now, and we're going to head up the track, come out the cemetery, and begin our journey out into these vast open fields. The tracks here are communal tracks. Anyone can walk down them, and occasionally you'll have farmers pass you in tractors. Some people come up here in 4x4s or cars, but generally you don't see that many people, and you don't see that many people walking this ground, and perhaps there should be more who do. But one of the things about walking it, as you begin your journey away from the cemetery, and it's always worth pausing and stopping and looking back and seeing these cemeteries and seeing these places from different angles, is that you begin to appreciate the contours of the Somme battlefields. I often come across people who describe the Somme as a billiard table. When you stand up here, you can see that is very, very far from the truth. This is rolling chalk downland. It may not be as impressive as the South Downs in my native Sussex. It's not a ridge in Wales or Scotland, but it's not flat. And you can see how height gives you an advantage, because the further you go along this track, you are on high ground, and you will have a view back to Courcelette, of course, but across to Pozieres, and ahead of you in the distance towards the next ridge, the Thiepval ridge, on which sits the huge, unmistakable archway of the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing, designed by Edwin Lutyens, commemorating the missing of the Somme. More than 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers commemorated on there. But that too is one of your marker points as you walk along these tracks. And we are, as I've said, away from the modern world, away from civilization. So far is it removed from modern housing that just up the road from where we are, there's a track. We come to a crossroads of tracks. To the left would take you to Pozieres, to the right up towards Regina Trench. Down there is a point where the Somme bomb squad used to blow up large-scale munitions that couldn't easily be moved to their depot further away, because it was a point where they could blow things up and it wouldn't affect any local buildings or housing. So far was it from the nearest bit of civilization. And in many respects, we're kind of seeing a forgotten Somme, because although there are some military cemeteries up here, there's no big memorials, there's no routes as such that mark these walkways, and it's not a place that the kind of uninitiated, the casual visitor, would necessarily end up. But there's so much history here. As we walk further up this track, we're coming into the ground where the Canadians made their attacks following the capture of the village. Over to our right, we can see the contours of the ground and how the ridge drops away into a valley. And on that reverse slope, that's where Regina Trench, the longest German trench on the Western Front, that ran from near Thiepval to the other side of Courcelette towards Les Sars, that's where it ran, in that reverse slope position. Gave it a perfect defensive position for the Germans to defend against Canadian attacks here in September and October of 1916. In the early assaults, they resulted in heavy losses for the Canadians, who couldn't really see where Regina Trench was, and the Germans had the advantage with sally ports coming forward from the trench with machine guns in them and observers for their artillery that were hidden away in the Ancre Valley beyond. And the Canadians gradually eked their way across this landscape, but at such huge cost. By the close of the fighting, down to that track to our right towards Regina Trench and beyond it, close to a position known as Desire Trench, where the Battle of the Somme for the Canadians came to an end on the 18th of November 1916, Canada here at Courcelette had lost 24,000 men killed, wounded and missing. And this one single battlefield, the largest number of Canadian missing for one small area, is here for the entire Great War. Over 6,000 men on this landscape we can see around us now are still missing. As we've said, half the names on the memorial to the missing at Vimy Ridge, which is not just that triumphant memorial to the capture of the ridge in 1917, but a memorial to the missing, to Canada's soldiers who have no known grave and were killed in France from 1915 until the end of the war. But half of them are men killed here. So this is a landscape that still very much holds its secrets. And as we continue along this track, if you use copies of trench maps on your walks, or you have Great War Digital, the Linesman product, which works with a tablet or on your smartphone, where they've got GPS-orientated maps that show you where you are on that First World War landscape, one of the things that you'll come across when you walk along here is a reference to equipment and rifle dumps along here. And this appears to have been when this ground was cleared during the winter of 1916-17, and they found a lot of material that they hoped to salvage, and there was a big pile of rifles and trench mortars and ammunition and mortar bombs and shells and grenades and everything else awaiting salvage. Now, some of that no doubt was actually salvaged, but over the years of walking this ground, what I've discovered, there's still a lot of it here. And as always, when we see these munitions from the Great War, we look, we photograph, we don't touch, and we certainly do not pick it up. These are parts of the landscape, part of the legacy of the Great War on this landscape, and they can, again, they're not here by accident. They can tell us quite a lot about the use of position or the type of fighting that was taking place here, but they are not to be trivialized, and they are not to be tampered with in any shape or form, because sadly the Great War still results in casualties. Visitors who don't understand this, people who live on this landscape generally do, so accidents with them, unless they're crazy collectors looking for this stuff, are pretty rare. But this is material that was designed to kill, and even more than a century later it still can. But it is part of this landscape, and it is interesting, and fascinating to see it as you walk across this ground. So the Great War really, even in these ploughed fields, in these cultivated fields of Picardy, of northern France, the Great War is never really far away. And aside from the dangerous stuff in the fields, you'll see shell shard, what we'd call shrapnel, fragments of jagged metal that are from shells that have been torn apart by explosions, designed to kill and to maim, and that's exactly what they did more than a century ago in 1916. We'll see them. We'll see the lead balls from shrapnel shells that were designed to explode in the air and rain down shrapnel balls to kill infantry or to cut wire. Some fields have thousands of shrapnel balls scattered across them each time they plough. And among it is just about everything else that was here during the war, from bayonets to helmets to water bottles to mess tins and to more personal equipment. I never go looking for this stuff. If it wants you to find it, my view is it will find you. And I have friends who have kind of an incredible sense for this. Tim Thurlow, who we interviewed in a very early episode of the Old Front Line, he's particularly good at walking these fields and connecting to them via the artifacts that remain here today, many of which he's given to local collections and museums in this area. For me, I don't always pick up everything. I certainly don't really pick up shrapnel balls and bits of shell fragment. I kind of feel that they should stay there somehow. They're part of that landscape. But the tangible objects of the past are really important. We talk about the importance of objects a lot on this podcast, and I think it is important to connect to the landscape via this too. So I don't think there's really much wrong with walking a track and finding a shrapnel ball and picking it up, because that's something you'll take home with you and you'll put on your shelf, and every time you look at it, you'll think of that time you were on the Somme or at Arras or wherever it was you found that echo of the First World War in that tangible object. But coming back to what we see as we walk this ground, where as we continue along this track, coming up into line with, on our left, quite a large farm complex, and in the distance an even better view of that Thiepval ridge with the Thiepval Memorial sitting on the crest of it. But the farm buildings to our left are the Ferme de Maky Farm, Maky Farm, Maky Farm to the troops. It had quite a few different names. We've covered this in a specific podcast episode. You can go back through the catalogue to find that. But it is one of those dark corners of the Somme which seemed to engulf the lives of so many thousands of soldiers there in 1916. First the Australians, this was their left flank on the battlefield at Pozieres, which, following the capture of the village, one part of the Australian units moved into this area to try and take the farm because it guarded the approaches towards the Thiepval Ridge and the high ground beyond. And unit after Australian unit made an attack on the farm. Sometimes they'd take the ruins of it. The Germans would pop up out of the cellars or the tunnels that were here and attack them from the rear, and the Australians would be pushed back. There was attack, counter-attack, counter-attack, toing and froing, until after nearly 2 months of fighting, the Australians handed over a position that was very close to the farm, and that became the Canadian front line when the Canadian Corps moved into this area in early September 1916 before their attack on Courcelette village. And units like the Canadian Scottish, who occupied the line here, in their regimental history, they talk about suffering as many casualties here just by holding the line as they had done during the gas attack, the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915. So just by holding this position in front of Maky Farm, it was incredibly costly for any troops that were given that task. And the Canadians on the 15th September, the Canadian Mounted Rifles, made an attack here. They too got into the farm, but the Germans counterattacked and pushed them back. And by this stage, already Maky Farm was turning into just dust with all of the fighting and all of the bombardments. But it escaped capture by the Canadians. They handed over to the British, and it was finally taken by men of the 11th Northern Division, who the previous year had fought at Gallipoli at Suvla Bay and were now on the Western Front. They took it in October of 1916, and gradually the line moved forward either side, the Canadians pushing up to the high ground of Regina Trench, and the British taking the village of Thiepval and Thiepval Ridge, and beyond it the Schwaben Redoubt. And Maky Farm was then fought over again in March of 1918, and finally in August of the same year, when men of the 38th Welsh Division advanced through here on the flanks of the 17th Northern. Two units that were pushing the Germans back in this sector and advancing roughly towards the Albert-Bapaume Road, with one peeling off towards Longueval and beyond the Morval Ridge. That was the Welsh lads, and the others getting nearer towards the ridge of Ligny-Tilloy, just south of Bapaume itself. Another battle on the Somme, the final battle in that summer of 1918. But again here, we're not ever seeing anything in isolation. We're discussing the Battle of 1916, but this was ground that had seen fighting in 1914 as the Germans pushed the French back, and then in those final battles of the last year of the Great War. So the crisscross paths of all of it cross over almost everywhere, every step, really, that we take as we walk these tracks. Today, when we look at Maky Farm, we can look at the 1920s buildings, the farmstead that was rebuilt after the war. That's kind of on the left-hand side of the plot where Maky Farm once stood, and to the right there's an area surrounded by trees, and that was where the original farm was located. That ground was never salvageable after the war. Speaking to someone who was born in here just before the Great War and had a memory of returning here in 1919, it was literally by then just dust. There was nothing really to indicate where the farm had been. And this chap's farmer spent most of their first few weeks here trying to figure out where the farm boundaries had once been located. But it was clear to this chap's father that to rebuild the farm in that area of ground where it had been before 1914 was just going to be impossible. So instead it was rebuilt on the opposite side of the track. And it's still in the same family, the hands of the same family that had it before the Great War. The farm was owned by Monsieur Gons, who was the mayor of Courcelette, and he had a tenant farmer, the Van den Drisch family. They had it before the Great War, and descendants of them still have it today. So quite a nice kind of continuum in that. But I remember walking that ground over the years with many, many Australians, including representatives of the Australian government who back in the late 90s and early 2000s were looking to build a visitor centre, an Australian visitor centre on the battlefields of the First World War to tell Australia's story, which eventually became the centre, the Monash Centre that is now at Villers-Bretonneux on the Somme. But they wanted to look at almost every site where the Australians had fought to get a sense of what was there, and was one place better than another to build this centre. And we came here and we walked that shell-pocked land where the original farm had been located, and it was in the spring, and you could see the shapes of the shell holes in the fields and bits of concrete where the Germans had fortified it. And talking to Monsieur Van den Drisch, he described how the cavernous cellars that were beneath the farm were still a problem to them because they couldn't put any heavy machinery across that bit of ground, and that's why it never been cultivated in his time, because there was fear of collapse. Yet again, I guess another legacy of the First World War, how land really is unusable because of the events of the Great War more than a century later. But we need to look beyond where our immediate area is when we walk this ground. So we're walking up past Maky Farm, the ground rises again, Thiepval ahead of us, Regina Trench is now behind us to our right, Courcelette behind us in the distance, and if we look to our left, over the top of the rooftops and the hangar roofs of Maky Farm, in the far distance on a clear day, we may catch sights of the Golden Virgin, the figure of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus that sits atop the tower of the Basilica in Albert. And German soldiers who were here in 1916 would have seen the original at that crazy 90-degree angle from positions like this. So Maky Farm, which before the Battle of the Somme had been a German headquarters and a dressing station, and where some of their artillery units had been located, those men would have seen that distant target of the tower, which they knew was in the hands of first the Poilus, the French, and later Der Tommies, the British, and it would have been just as familiar a landmark to them as it was to the British and Commonwealth soldiers who were here during that period of the First World War. But we can also see two key villages that connect us to the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. We can see the village of Ovier, and then across the valley to it, La Boisselle. And that valley is Mash Valley, and on the other side of the Albert-Bapaume Road, the other side of La Boisselle village, was Sausage Valley. That was named first because of a sausage-shaped observation balloon, and if you have a Sausage Valley, you have to have a Mash Valley as well, and that's how Mash Valley got its name. And you can see from a distance just how important these valleys were and how they created a kind of a killing ground. So if any force moved up that ground, they had the potential to be fired at from not just machine guns, but a huge amount of artillery in a funneled area, causing, as it did in 1916, heavy losses indeed. So again, this is kind of all part of our understanding of how the landscape forms not just what we see of the landscape of the present, but also it helps us understand the landscape of the past and how that influenced the outcome of these battles here in 1916. But as we go over the top of the rise here and the track drops down a little way, in the fields on the left for many, many years there was a big quarry here which the Germans had used as a quarry during the war, and we're right on the edge of the original outskirts of Thiepval village. Ahead of us, this track meets the Pozières-Thiepval road, and just beyond the next bend were the first terraced houses that were there before the Great War. Thiepval was a very big village and had lots of terraced housing in it for the estate workers who worked for the chateau that was there and the main employer for this area. And because the owners of that chateau died during the war, obviously never returned, the estate workers never returned either, and Thiepval became a mere shadow of its former self, which we can see today by looking at that skyline and seeing that most of the buildings that are there date from the 1970s or later, let alone the 20s. There were hardly any rebuilt in the 20s. Most of these are much more modern buildings, and that gives us a bit of an insight into just how close many of these villages on the Somme came to being villages détruits, villages disparus, destroyed, disappeared villages, just as you see on the Chemin des Dames or in the Champagne or at Verdun in the French sector of the Western Front. But we can also see from here how Thiepval dominates. This ridge is an important feature on this part of the battlefield, and whoever possesses it commands this ground. Beyond it, towards the Ancre Valley, behind it, back towards Albert and where the British and before that the French front lines would be. And then once an offensive went through and positions like Pozières and Ferme de Mouquet and beyond that Courcelette were taken, the Thiepval Ridge continued to dominate even those locations too. So for there to be any kind of success in this area, the whole ground here had to be pushed forward. It all had to be taken, and Thiepval was eventually, after 2.5 months of fighting with disastrous losses there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and again something we've looked at in previous podcasts, this was an area captured by the men of the 18th Eastern Division, which attacked it from a different angle using tanks on the 26th of September 1916 with an incredible and very powerful artillery plan, wiped out the German defenders, moved through the German defences from the Leipzig salient into the outskirts of the village and beyond, and linked up with the fighting that was simultaneously taking place in the massive German defensive work that was very close to Thiepval village, which was the Schwaben Redoubt. Again, something we've looked at as an individual bit of battlefield in a previous podcast episode. So Thiepval was eventually taken, and that kind of opened the way to the Ancre Valley beyond. We talk of the Battle of the Somme as if British soldiers were crisscrossing the Somme River or very close to it all the time. Really, that was much closer to where the French troops were in 1916, and many British soldiers came to the Somme and perhaps never saw the Somme River itself. But The main river for them was the Ancre, that ran in this northern part of the battlefield. And instead of carrying on to meet that main road into Thiepval village, we'll take a track off to our right and then another one off to our left, a dead straight bit of track that takes us into and through a farm complex. And this is an area where some of those tanks that were assisting the men of the 18th Eastern Division swung round this flank of Thiepval village, and at least one of them ditched very close to where we're standing. There used to be a little line of trees here, and when I mashed it up with a trench map and later linesman, that was where the tank had been knocked out or disabled or had just ditched. I'm not entirely sure what its fate was or even which tank it was, but it's marked on the trench maps as a derelict tank. And again, you might see that on linesman if you're ever using it in this area. So this puts us very close to another of these German redoubts, in this case Stuff Redoubt. And the Germans use these circular shaped defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, thick belts of wire to protect them, tunnel systems, deep dugouts, machine guns. They use them quite a lot, not just here on the Somme, but right across the Western Front. But here at Thiepval, with a ridge line that dominated, and on the flanks of it, several distinctive defensive positions, of which the Schwaben Redoubt and the Stuff Redoubt here were two of the most significant. And then close by, the beginnings of Regina Trench that went up, along, and beneath that high ground at Thiepval, built on that reverse slope to give it a perfect defensive position. We can again begin to connect up those dots, connect up those jigsaw pieces, and understand how each bit of the landscape works together and how it influenced the events in 1916. And walking up through the farm, many of the farms in this area, somewhere normally tucked out of view, have a junk pile, a pile of First World War junk, and that's kind of the best way to describe it. And again, of course, on a farm, you're on private property. This is a communal track. You're walking along to get from one part of a system of tracks onto a main road. So you can quite legitimately walk down here, but you can't kind of rummage through their junk pile. You can go and speak to the farmer and ask them, and that's something that I've done over many years. And all too often, they're very keen for you to take items away because it is just junk to them. But don't be surprised if they're offering you steel helmets that have half a dozen live Mills grenades in them, but don't be taking those away. So there is an inherent danger. But to me, it's not taking away the objects or even picking up the objects. It's just seeing this detritus of war that is still here after 100 years. And I'm not guaranteeing you'll see one along this track because I can't remember actually exactly where their one is. It's probably in one of their courtyards, but this is the kind of thing you would expect to see on this landscape. But we're using this track to walk through this area of farm buildings where the extension, before 1914, the extension of the terraced houses ran right along this road that we're coming up to now. And the road that we're approaching and coming onto is the Thiepval Grandcourt road. The village of Grandcourt is down in the valley to our right, and Thiepval we can see in the distance to our left. There's an area of trees there, a kind of triangular shaped area of trees, which is the village cemetery, on the same spot where the village cemetery had been before the Great War. And just beyond that, in the next field, is the last vestige of the old Thiepval, the circular brick-built well, which is still there after all that time. Impossible to see in the summer when the crops are there, but very visible during those winter months. But we've come onto a road that takes us onto the next bit of the battlefield, and when we turn right here and walk past the farm buildings and some of the cottages that are here today, we come to a long line of trees going out into the field and following the contours of the ground as it drops away into the valley, the Ancre Valley. We can see the river, particularly in the winter. We can see the river through the trees, meandering its way through this valley, the significant feature on this part of the battlefield. And this long line of trees, typical of France, I think for most of us, when we think of France, we think of roads lined with trees. But this kind of feature of trees going out into a field was once also very, very typical. But with so many different tree diseases in the last few decades, then a lot of these have disappeared. When I think what the Somme was like when I first walked it in 1982 with my dad, the Albert-Bapaume road was lined with trees, even some of the side roads, the old road from Amiens towards Albert, which the soldiers had marched down, much of that still had trees along it as well. All of that has kind of disappeared, and tree-lined avenues are very, very difficult to find these days. But this one sits as a kind of main landmark on the slopes of the Ancre Valley. Over to our left is the Ulster Tower. We can see that in the distance. Beyond it, Thiepval Wood. We can see Mill Road Cemetery close to the site of the Schwaben Redoubt. Just this side of it, there's a track that drops down the valley towards Saint-Pierre-d'Ivillon, and the Schwaben Redoubts was there. And then if we look to the right of the trees, we're looking down in the valley towards Grandcourt. Beyond, we can see Beaucourt, and on the ground above Beaucourt village is a square-shaped wood. That's the Bois de Hollande, and that's where the Royal Naval Division was advancing in November 1916, and that in that area is where the Battle of the Somme came to an end. In fact, from here, you can look to your left down the Ancre Valley, and you can see the ground close to the village of Hamel, where the Ancre British Cemetery is today. That's where the Battle of the Somme began in July. And then look to your right and see that square-shaped Bois de Hollande, and that's where it came to an end in November. It's one of those places where you can literally see the beginning and the end of the Battle of the Somme. The valley beneath us was used prior to the Battle of the Somme by the Germans to have their field artillery in, so the guns that were supporting the Württemberg troops that defended Thiepval, they were in this valley, and the communication trenches that took the Germans from places like Grandcourt up towards the front line area around the Schwaben Redoubt, they were also in these fields as well. And the fighting reached here in November of 1916. This became one of the kind of high tide marks of the Battle of the Somme in this sector close to Thiepval. And we've got some evidence of that just down the road. As we continue along this road towards Grandcourt, the road bends, and then there's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission sign, and down a little track, which is partially sunken in one point, we come to Stump Road Cemetery. This is quite a small battlefield cemetery. There's 263 burials in here, of which when you walk along the rows of graves, you see are mostly unidentified. In fact, 213 of the 263 are unidentified soldiers. What we do see, though, looking at the cap badges, that they're dominated by several different regiments. The largest number of burials are from the 7th Battalion, the Queen's Regiment. Then there's a lot of men from the 7th Buffs, the 7th East Kents, and also the 7th Royal West Kents. And all of those were fighting in this area in November 1916 at the kind of fag end of the Battle of the Somme. And also particularly numerous are men from the 13th Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment. And then there's a number of other regiments kind of scattered amongst them. This was an original burial ground started by men from the 7th Buffs in November 1916 when they probably buried men in shell holes here. Stump Road was the name given to the track that you've just walked up. Back in the 80s, when I went to Stuttgart to stay with my old friend Klaus, I discovered that Stump was the name of a German officer. Now, I don't know whether the British discovered that or captured a map in which this was called Stump Road by the Germans, so they called it Stump Road, but there is a connection here to an actual person, rather than, as I thought for a long, long time, Stump Road referred to the fact that there were some kind of stumpy little trees along the bank that is here. But a wartime cemetery that was then enlarged after the war, but it still is very much a comrade cemetery with those men from those different battalions, the Queens, the Buffs, the Royal West Kents, and the 13th Cheshires. They kind of mark what happened here. They're that beacon to the events of 1916 through the graves and the dates and the names that are on those headstones in this small battlefield cemetery. And I think that the smaller cemeteries, we come from Courcelette, which is quite a large one. not the largest by any imagination, but a larger cemetery of the First World War and largely concentrated burials, to this kind of small battlefield comrade cemetery where men who served together, fought together and died together are buried. For some people, I think the larger cemeteries are very difficult to take in, and these smaller ones is where it somehow becomes more personal. And again, through reading the names that are on the headstones and researching these men, we kind of bring these treasure troves of Great War history, these time capsules of that period of 1914-18, we kind of bring them alive again. And there are many cemeteries, like the World War I Cemeteries website, that is great for this because they have a page for every cemetery, and people have submitted photographs of men that are buried, in some cases women also, that are buried in those cemeteries, and you can go on there and you can see some of the faces of those whose graves that you find in your travels through these silent cities. But coming out the cemetery gate and walking the path that rejoins the minor road, further up the track, the road is quite heavily banked, particularly on the right-hand side, and there's some shallow steps leading up to a small grass path that goes across the fields, and we can just see the top of another cross of sacrifice. That War Graves Commission sign at the beginning of this track indicated two burial grounds up here, Stump Road and Grandcourt Road Cemetery. And standing on the road here, looking up over that bank and seeing that cross, I know that in there are many men of my beloved South Downs battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment who were killed in an attack here in October 1916. Many of those lads are buried there, but that's a tale for another day. But what I hope that this walk has done for you is to give you a sense that you can just begin a pathway across a battlefield like the Somme, and you can find en route so much history, so many criss-cross paths of that history, the beacons, the cemeteries and the memorials, the detritus of war, how the landscape is still affected by what happened here in 1916. And all of that builds our understanding and our connection to this wider landscape of the Great War on the Western Front. So standing here on these windswept heights above the Ancre Valley, where even in the winter you can still hear the skylarks singing high above in one of those clear blue winter skies, we pause and reflect on what life in the trenches here, full of snow, in sub-zero temperatures, must have been like for that generation who was here in that terrible winter of 1916-17. And even on a cold, crisp day, feeling bleak and alone on this landscape, we've only but the tiniest, the smallest of insights into this really. But the symmetry of the weather on this landscape today helps us, I think, to understand those cold, frozen days in that distant, but often perhaps not so distant past, that takes us, pushes us in some respects along those pathways of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.